It is my pleasure to introduce the 19th president of Rensselaer Polytech Institute, Dr. Marty Schmidt, class of 1981. Prior to his arrival at RPI just over... Hi. Go back in. No. Prior to his arrival at RPI just over 2 years ago, Dr. Schmidt served as the provost at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He earned his BS degree in electrical engineering from RPI in 1981, and his master's and PhD from MIT, both in electrical engineering and computer science. Today, Marty will be hosting a conversation with alumnus RJ Scaringe, class of 2005. RJ is the founder and CEO of American automotive manufacturer Rivian. Since Rivian's founding, RJ has led the company through a strategic vision that transcends the profound change we will see. And we will see this change in the future, in our future, within the transportation industry over the next decades. We look forward to hearing from RJ about his experiences at RPI and how those experiences shaped his future. Please join me now in welcoming President Schmidt and RJ Scaringe to the stage. Thank you, Glenn.
Welcome back.
All right, yeah.
I have to find
here when I was here.
Yeah, so it's an amazing building. So let me just start up. We're delighted to have you back, but I also want to do a shout out because we've got a lot of Scaringes here. RPI runs deep in the Scaringe family. RJ's father, Bob Scaringe, of the RPI class of 1974 and 75, founder and president of Mainstream Engineering, is here celebrating his 50th reunion. Bob's wife, Florida State Senator. Yep. Bob's wife, Florida State Senator Debbie Mayfield, is also joining us. RJ's brother, Ryan Scaringe, of the RPI class of 2015, another founder and president. Ryan is a film producer, and his company, Kinogo Pictures. And three more members of RJ's family are here, namely RJ's sons, Pete, Max, and Miles, who will be recruiting to RPI in the future. So welcome, Scaringe clan. So RJ, the origin story of Rivian is fascinating. I mean, how you came to create Rivian, and I understand a lot of it formulated as a child. So do you want to talk a little bit about the lead up to coming to college?
Sure, yeah. So I, since I was a kid, I was like deeply enthralled by cars, everything that goes into the technology, the freedom they provide, the ability to go places, and got really into knowing everything about every car on the road. And as I was learning more and more about the automotive industry and cars, also realized that these things I fell in love with so much as a kid were at the root of so many of our challenges as a society. Everything from local air quality to some of the disputes we're having across the world to, of course, our emissions, our carbon emissions, and therefore impact on the climate. And when I was a teenager, I decided I wanted to do something about it and wanted to start a car company. And I had no idea what that meant. What does starting a car company even entail? So of course, talked to my dad about it. My dad said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, you should do that. Which is great to have that kind of support to such a wild idea. But decided I was gonna go to school, get a degree in engineering, and essentially designed my sort of curriculum around wanting to be in the space. And so finished school here, then went to grad school and started the company right after. And the thing that makes a car company particularly unique and particularly challenging is it requires so many really hard things at the same time that are all interdependent. Meaning, if you're being intellectually honest about what it takes, you need many billions of dollars, you need thousands of engineers. You need a manufacturing plant that would take years to build and billions of dollars of capital to create, a brand that people care about, a product design with features and characteristics that combine into something that ultimately customers are going to want to buy. And you need hundreds of suppliers to make all the parts, everything from tires and seats to castings, wiring harnesses, all the parts across the vehicle. And if you had all those things in the very beginning, it would still take you 5 years to launch your first product. But in fact, you start with none of those things. And so it was, it's certainly a steep hill looking back, and it probably looks steeper looking back than it did when I was looking forward back in 2000, early 2000s, 2005 through 2009. But a lot of the time here was spent really thinking about that, and actually designed some courses that were independent studies. And it was great to be able to work with faculty to start to pull at and understand how automotive industry works. Of course, being a student, you get access to anything, so you could show up at a plant or at a vehicle manufacturer and say, hey, I'd like to understand how you do this. And they're not exactly looking at a 22-year-old student and saying, boy, this person's a huge threat. Come on in, we'll show you everything. So I really enjoyed that. I don't have those same benefits anymore. But yeah, I mean, it was just an incredible journey, and it's hard to imagine the journey I've taken with Rivian without RPI and without being here and the growth that happened here for me.
Well, we love hearing that, right? But just curious, I mean, so you obviously must have had a subscription to Motor Trend.
Yeah, I have a lot of car assets that I accumulated growing up, and
I think I heard some of this.
Yeah, I had car parts all over the house. My dad moved houses after I left home. And I remember he was cleaning out the attic, and there's a windshield in the attic. There's a hood in one of the closets.
You're just building your supply chain.
So I had all sorts of parts I'd accumulate. And yeah, so that was sort of how I grew up, and I accumulated tons of magazines, collected magazines, but I was just so into cars. So it's been really exciting to now be building a brand that generates and ignites that same type of interest and excitement that other brands had done for me.
So you get your driver's license probably when you're 16.
Yeah.
What car would you want? And you're 16 years old.
What did I get?
Or what did you aspire to?
Well, when I was 16, I bought a Volkswagen Corrado.
Okay.
Which is like, yeah, there we go. 3 people know. But which was like a little fun little sports car kind of thing. I then subsequently started to modify it and took what was a very good car and made it a far less good car.
I think I actually did that too.
Yeah.
You take the engine apart, and when you put it back together, when there's some parts left on the table.
It's a little louder, a little less smooth, but at any rate, yeah, that was the first car. Interestingly, it's the only non-EV that I own today. I bought another one just because it was a fun thing to have.
Yeah.
But saying all that, that first car, got my driver's license on my first day, the day I turned 16. And I think cars ignite interest. I have three kids now, 3 boys, as you said, Pete, Max, and Miles. And seeing them now look at the world as a child with the same, I'd say without the dogma that's embedded on us or put on top of us over time, and just being curious. And I ask them, they'll come into the design studio with me, and I'll ask them for ideas. And they're so fresh. The ideas have none of the scaffolding that frames our thinking as adults. It's so free, it's so open. And I remember feeling like that as a kid and looking at cars and dreaming about what could be. And I say all the time to our teams and our designers, like, we need to keep the kid in our heads, because we're able to dream bigger, think without constraint. It's really powerful.
So I think people would love knowing some of your experiences at RPI, but maybe I'd frame the question and say, what was the best and worst day in your time at RPI? And I happen to know that you graduated from RPI with a 4.0. So your worst day could not have been getting a 16 on an exam like Reed Weissman explained to us.
Yeah.
He had.
Well, there's lots of things I think that people get from going to school. You learn how to interact, you learn how to be independent, you learn how to set goals and then go after those goals. for me, it was really interesting because I started my first year and I did first semester, had straight A's, and I said, oh, that's good. Let's try to keep doing that. And then second semester I had straight A's, and then I said, oh, I'm going to try to do this the whole time. And it was incredible for building confidence because it was one of the nice things about school, which you actually don't have in life, is there's such a clear scoreboard. You know at the end of a semester how you did. Did you get an A? Did you get a B? And so that was really powerful to set a goal, work really hard at it, and then achieve it. And it really sort of bled into how I've approached a lot of things. So grad school, certainly, but much more than that. Building a company, it's a whole series of goals. I will say it's much harder to get a 4.0 in building a car company. I certainly haven't, but that was also a big transition, is going from a world in which things are highly measured, which there's clear and crisp results that you're seeing, to a world in which you know you're not always getting an A, but you have to self-assess, or sometimes people assess for you, and they're generally not grading with a curve. And so you for me, but the big part was that confidence building aspect of setting a goal and going after it.
That's great. So then you go to MIT, so we share that academic arc of RPI and MIT, although only one of us got a 4.0 at RPI. I was trying to think about, why you chose to go to graduate school, because it's interesting. There is another person recently who built a car company named Elon Musk. Now, he happened to have graduated from UPenn with a bachelor's. And it says on his bio that he went to Stanford for graduate school, but on the second day he dropped out. So ostensibly, there's an existence proof that you don't have to have a PhD to build a car company.
Yeah, that's true.
But you went there, and then I looked up your PhD thesis. What you did was the homogeneous charge compression ignition engine, which offers diesel-like efficiency with very low soot and NOx emissions. So clearly you were committed to doing things to improve the planet through that. But so what did the PhD do for you? And by the way, record completion time. Yeah. Typically a PhD, you probably did master's 2 years, do the PhD for 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5. You got out in 4 years total.
Yeah, it was the fastest PhD, master's plus PhD, at the time that had gone through mechanical engineering. So it was, but at that point, there's a lot of elements to that. But I guess going back to your first question, the thing that's different about grad school than undergrad is you have a thesis, you have a project that you're working on, and in some ways you're the CEO of your thesis. You're designing the experiments. You're designing if you have things you're building. You're designing the test apparatus. You have some budget that you're managing. Maybe you have a few research assistants, undergraduate research assistants that are helping you. So you have maybe a small staff, and so my master's and flowing into my PhD were great for learning how to essentially run a small effort. And I did it, as you pointed out, I did a PhD in vehicle efficiency. In this case, because this was starting in 2005, the majority of the funding available, and therefore the majority of the work happening was in making combustion engines more efficient. And sitting here today, certainly with the convictions I hold, but I'd say broadly with the understanding we have of the space, it's a lot clearer what the end state looks like. But in 2005, there was a lot of discussion around what's the pathway to move to a carbon neutral transportation system, and what's the staircase between, what's the steps between. So while none of the things I worked on in my thesis from a technical point of view applied at all to what I've ultimately built with Rivian, the exercise in solving a hard problem, and a problem for which at the beginning of the solution you don't know the answer, by very definition of it being a PhD, is really helpful. And it's not a hard problem that you solve on a weekend. It's a hard problem that you work on for a couple of years. So it's sufficiently difficult that you need to have a level of determination and willingness to burst through a few brick walls, which I think a PhD is great training for. Now, you said it, and I would agree. You definitely don't need to have a PhD to start a company. And I think everyone has a different path. For me, there was a lot of points along that journey where I was debating dropping out of school. And for those that remember, back in 05, 06, 07, it was like the first influx of capital, of investment that was going into what at the time, or what for the first time we were calling the clean tech movement. And so I started to do business plan competitions, pitching this idea of a car company. That was really, that was so wonderful for me, because I had not been in an environment where I had to pitch or respond to questions on a dynamic environment. And the learning curve was so sharp. So I'd go into these things and think, I got this idea, it's so clear in my head. Then I'd try to talk about it, and it comes out so fuzzy. And I'm like, this doesn't sound very good. And so ultimately, became a bit better at that. And through it, actually had opportunities to leave school and have some funding to start the business. Made the decision to finish my PhD, largely because I thought, to start a car company, I'm gonna need a lot of money. I don't have any money, certainly not of the magnitude that would take to start a car company. And I need some form of credibility. And I was like, well, I'm not gonna have the experience of, I started 2 car companies before, or I worked in automotive for 30 years. So a PhD seems about as good as I can get, and the quickest form of credibility I could get. So I finished the PhD, and the next day I officially started the company.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You just literally left campus. I think you started in Florida, right?
I incorporated in Delaware.
So when you think about it, that was 2009. We just experienced the Great Recession.
Yeah.
You're getting into an industry where you need $1 billion of capital.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, GM and Chrysler had needed bailouts from it.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a interesting time, I suppose, to get in. And I know, I thought you could talk a little bit about that moment. You had some pretty interesting ways in which you, with the assistance of your father, got some of that early capital. Would love to hear about that. And then I think, take us up to when you had to do that pivot after the first car.
Well, I love this. We're going into the details.
Oh, I got a lot.
I see a binder there. Get ready. So as I said, starting a company like this does take a lot of money, and very different than most what we think of as like software companies or technology companies, where you can build your first idea, your product, for a really small amount of money. You can make it in your dorm room. You can make it, in your kitchen on a laptop. Sell a very crude version of that, show that there's market demand, raise some capital, add robustness, and go through that scaling loop. That's how really venture capital was designed to work. It was designed to have this series of investments that grow and scale as your business achieves more and more success. With a car company, it's so challenging because your first dollar of real revenue takes billions of dollars of investment and many years of time. So there's not a lot of clear signals back to investors to say, hey, this is gonna work out, or this is gonna go well. And so the hardest of all dollars to raise in a business like this are gonna be the first dollars, because the risk is infinitely high. Imagine if any of you are an investor and I walked in and said, I wanna start a car company, and say, okay, well, what's your technology? Well, I don't have any of that yet. Well, what does the car look like? I don't know. What's the brand? We still haven't named it. Well, who's the team? Well, it's me. Well, you must have a plan. So no, I don't have any assets. So it's just like, it's like this incredibly high risk proposition. Yeah. So because of that, my dad and I actually financed the beginning. So I had a house that I refinanced. My dad had a house that he refinanced. And again, as a father now, I appreciate even more that, his love for me and belief in me led him to do something that was financially highly irrational. And I hope to do that for my kids. But if it were not for that, it would have been impossible to get going. And that early capital allowed us to make enough progress, hire a few people to show, hey, there's some semblance of hope that this could actually amount to a full company. And then, it's not as if we refinanced our house, made a little widget prototype, and then raised $1 billion. It was like, well, then we raised a few $100,000, and then I raised a few $1 million. And so the buildup of capital took a period of years. But ultimately, we went public a few years ago. Prior to going public, we raised privately $14 billion. As a public company, we raised about $15 billion. So We've capitalized the business extremely well.
Yeah.
But it's, you don't start with those kinds of numbers. It's a much harder to get that first capital in.
And the first car you built was not an SUV or a truck. Is that right?
Yeah, well, actually, I'd take it even further. Before I started the company, I was debating in a whole series of like almost infinite do loops in my head of what should we build? What if I'm going to start a company, what should the product be? And ultimately settled on launching. Initially, the thought was launch a sports car, use the sports car to build a brand, use the brand to launch more mass market vehicles. And growing up a car enthusiast, that's sort of an obvious place to start. And worked on that for a couple of years, made a very crude prototype of that. And all the while, of course, meeting with investors, meeting with potential partners, supplier partners, technology partners, and having to tell the story, having to actually pitch the strategy. And I think having to tell your story is so powerful because it's sort of like teaching. When you can quickly tell if you actually know the topic, if you're teaching or not. You can also quickly tell if you believe the topic, if you're pitching. Do you really believe in your core what you're selling? And increasingly, I realized something wasn't quite right. And what it was is I felt we were trying to build something that already existed. Of course, Tesla had launched its brand with a sports car, the Roadster. It was already in the market before I even started Rivian. And not by design, but by coincidence or by accident, we ended up in a place that felt too similar to that. And so a few years in, made the decision to stop the effort on that, completely pause it, or completely shelve it, I should say, and pivot. And I think in the context of business, and certainly in the context of starting companies, I've a lot of friends, and I've advised a lot of folks who have started businesses. You hear the word pivot. It's like one of those words that gets used a lot in just general discussion on startups and have you pivoted? What's your pivot? Often it sounds as if you're pivoting, from a discrete point A to a discrete point B. Like, I have a really clear picture. I'm going to change exactly to this. I think more often than not, and what is more realistically the case, and for most companies, is the pivot's a bit fuzzy. And for us, it was very fuzzy. We stopped working on a sports car, but we didn't know what the next thing was. But we knew the question, and we spent a lot of time on saying, what's the question we're trying to solve? And the question we're trying to solve was, how do we maximize impact? Said differently, at this point, a small little 10-person company with 10 people working around the clock, pouring their souls into it. How can we impact change? How can we drive change into this massive 1.5 billion vehicle car park space that needs to, in my lifetime, go from something that is one of the major contributors of carbon emissions to something that's going to be carbon neutral? How can we be part of that? And so that question led us ultimately to what we now see as our strategy, which we launched a set of consumer products with flagship vehicles we call the R1T, the R1S. And we launched a commercial side of the business, which leverages that technology stack. And embedded in that transition, which that pivot was a slow pivot because it took us, call it a year and a half to really define what the next state was. We became really precise on our perspective on technology, and decisions that at that moment looked insane, which now look really smart, were things like, we're going to build all the electronics in the vehicle ourselves. So we're going to build and design the computers in the vehicle. We're going to build the software stack that sits on those computers. It's going to take us a lot more money, a lot more time to do it, but we wanted to vertically integrate the entirety of the digital ecosystem. And that's proven to be the right call. It certainly was a high-risk path, but not only has it allowed our products to be really differentiated in the market, but it has helped create an aligned business that allows us to leverage that software and electronics capability. We just did a $5 billion deal with Volkswagen. Right. For them to access our Volkswagen Group, so across all their brand portfolio, to access our software stack. And I would say, now it's more than 10 years later, this is one of the best software platforms ever put into a vehicle before, and the electronics and the computers that we design and build are really world-class. They're among the best in the world. So that decision, though, was something that we reached early on. We said, okay, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this really right, and we're going to invest the time and the money, and it's going to be hard as hell. And everyone we meet is going to tell us, this is crazy. You're starting a car company, that's hard. You think you're going to build the whole electronic supply chain. But we were convicted on it, and that conviction is what allowed us to drive through all those difficult moments.
It was genius. I happened to, I think it was back in it was in the spring of 22, I had announced that I'd be president of RPI, but I was still at MIT, and I met the CEO of Magna, contract vehicle manufacturer. And I said, well, I'm going to RPI, and RJ Scaringe is a graduate there. You must know him, right?
Yeah.
And he, oh yeah, we know RJ. He said, what he said to me was, he said, of all the electric vehicle startups that are out there right now, RJ's got the best shot.
Yeah.
And
there we go.
And he said that. And then the other thing he said is he was really disappointed that you didn't use them to build your car. And I think it's obvious that you couldn't, because you needed to build the whole thing.
Yeah. There's like thousands and thousands of decisions you make along the way. You hope that you make most of them in the right direction, but I think many of those decisions you can take the wrong call, and it doesn't change the final end result of what the business becomes. But a few of them are decisions you really have to get right. And for me, those around what are the technologies that you're developing in-house. And so we had the benefit, in part because we didn't have the capital, to spend the time contemplating where are we going to deploy our resources, what are we going to focus on, and I think we got a lot of those parts right.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I mean, not to name names, but what I've experienced in a plug-in hybrid is, you almost get the blue screen of death every once in a while, because as I think I've heard you say, each one of those sub-assemblies has its own computer, and you've got to go to that supplier to update their. So you don't have that problem, right? I mean, there's very few computers or less computers.
Yeah, I mean, with this audience, we could be perhaps maybe more technical. The way most cars are set up, and I say most cars, I should say, essentially all vehicles on the road with the exception of a Rivian or a Tesla, is you have a really complex web of small little computers that exist in the vehicle. And these computers, we call them electronic control units. And they come with some content in the vehicle, so they're domain or function based. So you have, let's say, power windows. There's a little computer that comes with the power window module with that. Powered seats, there's a little computer that comes with the seat. And so you end up with, at a vehicle level, 75 to 100 of these little ECUs scattered throughout the vehicle, all produced by different companies, all with different software stacks that communicate through a really sort of archaic communications protocol, and for which it's really hard to make holistic level changes to the software stack in the vehicle. So for example, with that architecture, if you wanted to change the sequence of how the vehicle reacted as you walked up to it, do the lights come on? Does it beep? Do the doors unlock? Does the air conditioner come on? You would have to coordinate amongst 10 to 15 different suppliers to say, I want it to honk in a slightly different way. I want the door to unlock at this timing. I want the lights to come on in this sequence. And so it makes updates to software very difficult. It also makes it a really challenging place to recruit great software engineers to work in, because you're dealing with this sea of separate islands for which other people wrote the software. And so in contrast, in a Rivian, you have a very small number of computers that control a lot of different functions, which is running a common operating system across those computers, and for which you can partition functions amongst any of those computers. So and they're geographically based. There's a computer in the front of the car, there's a computer in the back of the car, there's a computer in the middle of the car, and the middle of the car computer does stuff in the middle of the car. The computer in the front of the car connects to the stuff in the front of the car. And so it's how you would design what we would call a network architecture if you were looking at it with a clean sheet and from a first principles mindset. But if you evolved with the auto industry, where we saw electronics slowly make their way into the vehicle, over the last 60 plus years, you end up with this, just spread of little computers everywhere, because each thing you bought, they added a computer. And ironically, it is quite ironic, the first computers in the car were with fuel injection systems.
Right.
The reason it's ironic, because it's going to be the thing that goes out of the cars. But with all that said, this journey meant, like, to do this well, you need thousands of engineers on that problem alone, on building your software stack and your electronic stack.
Well, while we're on the software stack, I mean, the Volkswagen deal is very interesting. Because one could say, well, will Rivian ultimately be a software company?
Yeah. The Volkswagen deal is interesting for a lot of reasons. First, on a personal level, I said my first car is a Volkswagen. I grew up a Porsche and Volkswagen enthusiast. So I was super drawn to classic air-cooled Porsches, loved to work on them. It was sort of the car I always dreamed of when I was a kid, or the brand of cars I always dreamed of as a kid. So to now be working on the technology that's going to underpin those as they move forward in terms of what they're providing in terms of features and customer technologies is really outstanding. But the element of this is that if you're a big car company and you have lots of supplier relationships and you have this team that's been built around suppliers doing software, it's really hard to transition that business to building software or electronics because of the scale and because so much momentum has been put into this outsourced electronics, outsourced software approach. And to do it well, you really have to do it fully well, meaning you can't do like half of a zonal network architecture. You need to jump fully into the pool. And so we've realized this, and we realized that our platform has, by design, a lot of flexibility and scalability. So you can imagine we've had lots of discussions with lots of different car companies, lots of different big either OEMs or tier one suppliers in the space. And I was really happy. Volkswagen was our first choice for who we would launch this platform with outside of our own brands. We were really excited to be able to do that. And really at the core, it sinks so much into the mission. I talked about it a few minutes ago, of asking ourselves that question of how do we drive as much impact as possible? And being able to see our technology help make one of the largest manufacturers in the world more successful at launching their future technology vehicles, and therefore helping to accelerate the introduction of customer choice, giving customers more choices of interesting, fantastic products, couldn't be more aligned with our mission, and certainly motivates our team. We're all excited about that progress. Now, saying all that, we've also built a brand, and while we will pursue these opportunities to leverage and sell our technology where appropriate, the brand we built has really resonated in a beautiful way. And in fact, of all the things that have happened, that if you'd asked me to sort of ascribe a likelihood of happening, the thing I would have put the highest risk against, and from a probabilistic point of view, said it would be like the lowest probability, is the ability to create a brand quickly from scratch. So when you think of brands, particularly for consumer goods, things that we can, that we purchase and buy, brands sort of, the way they get created, it's a bit of magic. It's when you think about it, if think of a brand like Nike, that didn't mean anything 70 years ago to anyone, but now it actually has meaning. If you think of a brand like Porsche, you think of a brand like Ferrari, think of a brand like Apple, and there's not a single event that caused those brands to become immensely valuable and emotionally something that we as consumers connect with. And so you can try to recreate the exact sequence of like actions and events and product features that aggregate into a brand that ultimately leads to consumers caring about it deeply, but it's really hard to like build that map out. And so the thing I would have said was going to be the hardest is to build a brand that people care about. We used to jokingly say, maybe someday someone will get a tattoo of our brand. Like that's really meaningful. And there's a lot of people that have Rivian tattoos now, which is pretty wild. But so what's happened is the brand's connected. So we have flagship products today. They are expensive. We're coming out with our much lower price mass market products, which we call R2.
You have me on the list for that.
Yeah, R2. And then R3, so we've really creatively named them. And following R1. But the R1 product is, the R1S, our SUV, is the most popular vehicle in the premium segment, so vehicles priced over $70,000 in California. Not the most popular EV over $70,000, the most popular vehicle over $70,000. It's the market share leading electric vehicle over $70,000 across the whole country. And there's a bunch of groups that do independent brand studies. You probably know them. Groups like J.D. Power, Consumer Reports. In our first year of production with our first product, we had the highest level of brand satisfaction. And in our second year, we had that again, and we have the highest rate of repurchase. And then our brand appeal is 10 points higher than the next highest. So the brand, now we need to get more people to know about the brand, but for those that know about our brand and what the brand stands for and how we've built it brick by brick with a deep level of authenticity, has connected in ways that I never would have imagined. And so that being said, we wouldn't want to take this amazing brand that we're in the early stages of creating. It's this little tree that's starting to look a little bit more sturdy, but it's still a little tree. We want to continue to lean into that. We want to continue to inspire with that. And of course, this next set of products that are much lower price massively widens the aperture of consumers that can look at us and realistically afford to buy our products.
That's great. Let's think a little bit about the future. A lot of people, a lot of the things that have been coming out lately, more people are leaning towards plug-in hybrids out of range anxiety.
Yeah.
Do you see, and we have work being done here on alternatives to lithium-ion batteries,
Yep.
and one of our faculty is co-founder of one of those companies. But do you see significant changes in battery technology that are going to, or is there a solution to the range anxiety other than maybe just more chargers?
Yeah, a few questions sort of embedded in that. This is important to talk about. So first, let's just take a big step back. So I think it is important to recognize the scale that we're operating with. And certainly, for me, and for those that are either have an electric vehicle or follow this transition really closely, it may seem like we're fully in it and the world's electrified. There's 1.5 billion cars on the planet today. Almost all of them, nearly all of them, are still combustion powered. And in the United States, this year we'll hit about 8% of new vehicle sales are electric. And so on our current trajectory, we've got a long way to go. And even if 100% of new vehicle sales globally, and globally we make about 90 million cars a year, were electric, it would still take us 15 to 20 years to convert the global car park to electric drive. And so, said differently, we're at the very beginning of this massive transition. This is early days, it's the first or second inning. And that's true in a lot of ways. It's true in the lack of product choice. There's not a lot of great choices for customers to pick from. It's true in the early nature of our charging infrastructure. Today, there's really one great charging network, both in terms of scale and uptime, which is Tesla's network. We're building a network as well. There's only 2 networks in the United States that have uptime over 98%, us and Tesla. This is a real challenge if you have an EV and you pull up to a non-Tesla, non-Rivian charger and it doesn't work. That's extremely frustrating. So this is an area that's going to build out very rapidly, I believe, over the next decade. And then as you called out, battery technology is improving dramatically. The idea of a 300 or 400 mile SUV just a few years ago would have been impossible because of the energy density levels that we see in batteries just wasn't high enough. Right. And so energy density continues to improve. As you called out, there's a number of new chemistries that are being looked at. But it's very clear that this architecture is going to continue to have a runaway advantage over any form of fossil fuel combustion. The architecture is much simpler, obviously much cleaner. And I think one of the things that gets called out often as we look at this transition is the correct statement to say, well, if I plug an electric car into the grid still has fossil fuel on it. And just to call it the United States grid, in the US grid, it's about 60% of the grid's power on average across the whole set of utilities is carbon fueled. So natural gas, coal, to a lesser degree petroleum. Meaning the other 40% is about half nuclear, so 20% nuclear and 20% renewable. But even with a 60% carbon-based grid, because the conversion of energy from the battery to the drive, to the mechanical drive of the vehicle is so high, it's way more carbon efficient than the most efficient combustion-powered vehicles today. But interesting, it gets better over time. So you buy an electric vehicle today, and in 15 years, as the grid goes from 40% non-carbon based to 50, 60, 70% non-carbon based, your vehicle actually improves because the grid it's charging from is improving. And the timescales on this are just so long. So there's no perfect, easy green button we can press. This is, we instantly want to move off of our dependence on fossil fuels at a grid level and at a consumption level, at a vehicle level. It's going to take largely like my lifetime. You know, in the United States, there's over 2,000 coal power plants. There's over 2,000 natural gas power plants. These assets are going to take a long time to, you know, essentially decommission, to turn off and replace with new forms of energy.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask one last question because I realize there's a really fun fact about this question. And then we collected some questions from students who were so excited that you're here.
All right.
And I want to we'll rapid fire through them maybe.
Let's do it.
But I think it was at the pivot that you raised a substantial amount of funding with an MIT connection.
Yeah.
Can you say anything about that?
I would love to say something about that. That's a great question. One of the things I think we all hear going through school is you're going to make relationships that are going to matter throughout your life. And I think that's true in more ways than one. You make relationships with the school, you make relationships with faculty, perhaps you're making friends that are going to be lifelong friends, but you also build connections that can become valuable in ways that are hard to predict looking forward, but looking backwards, you're like, oh, of course, this and this person were really helpful to me. And MIT, as you know, has something called the infinite connection. It's a play on, there's a really long aisle or hallway at MIT called the infinite corridor, but it's a play on that to say there's an infinite connection. And when I was starting the company, imagine going and meeting with venture capitalists that are used to investing a few $1 million into the next Facebook. And when I said, well, I think I need a few $1 billion and I don't know if it's going to work, like there just wasn't a lot of enthusiasm from the traditional venture community to invest. And that's an understatement. You know, usually it's preceded by, this is a really bad idea. You're a smart guy. Don't waste your time. So I said, boy, I've got to come up with a different way to get this early capital to go from like the idea stage to something that's substantial enough to raise big dollars. And so I called up MIT and I said, hey, I'd like to come out and get your advice. So I went back to MIT and I spoke to a few folks there and basically said, I want to run a Boolean search. I want 3 filtering criteria. I said, I want to look for alumni. That's easy, lots of those. I want to look for alumni that are working in some way or form in automotive. Okay, still a lot of those. Number 3, I want to look for alumni that have given a substantial sum of money to the school, which is an important filter because it means 2 things. It means 1, they have capital, but 2, they have an intrinsic interest in directing that capital towards efforts that are going to improve the state of the world. You know, obviously they're investing capital into education. And I said, so they're more likely to take a risk on, you know, a 20-something-year-old guy starting a car company. And amazingly, and that was among many, I don't know, you could call them Hail Mary-like efforts to raise capital, this was the one that actually worked. Go long. That relationship has now become, they invested a small amount of money. It was somebody who's involved in automotive, knew the space, really big thinker, has funded Nobel Prize winning research. But he's also become one of my closest friends. And it was through that connection at MIT. Now, we didn't actually overlap while we were at school, but we had a shared set of professors and a shared set of advisors, some of which are still, you know, also close friends of mine. So I'd say to anybody who's a student, you know, the relationships you're making could and may come back to be helpful in ways you don't anticipate. Maybe you start a car company, you need $1 billion. Maybe you start another company, you need relationships, but they're really valuable. And I think when you're in school, you don't fully appreciate that until you get a little older. So
the reason why I wanted you to tell that story is it struck me when I was reading up on your background that Jamil is the investor.
Yeah.
And in addition to picking a winner in RJ, he funded the research of people, 2 faculty members who recently won the Nobel Prize in economics. Yeah. So
he's good at picking talent.
Picks good people.
Yeah. So funny. So early on in my meeting with him, we were meeting, we're talking, and I'm describing the strategy, and I'm like, I'm emphatically going through what we're going to do and how it's going to work. And he paused me and said, RJ, I don't really know about the strategy, but I do believe in you. And so he made that very clear. And it was important because the strategy evolved so many times. And one of the pieces of advice I often give founders of businesses that are in complex industries is to be really fixated on what your mission is, what your vision is, but to be quite flexible on the details. And I was advised that by a few friends of mine, and it's served us really well. And it's important to make that clear to investors that, hey, look, let's not get overly dogmatic on the tactics. The tactics should and will evolve, but the vision needs to be really crisp.
That's great. Fantastic. So let's see what the students want to know.
All right.
So we'll start with a question from Grace Yu, class of 2027, who is a member of the Rensselaer Motorsports Club.
All right.
Which competes by building a single-seater Formula-style race car every year from scratch. And in 2022, the club left internal combustion engines behind and started designing electric vehicles.
All right.
So the question Grace asks is, with the current trend of countries pledging to achieve 100% zero-emission vehicle sales within the next 10 to 20 years, what do you foresee as the biggest challenge to this goal?
Well, that's a great first question. So as a point of background here for everyone listening, the transition to electrification has two sort of forcing functions that are going to drive us to that end state. So the first is us as consumers, the choices we make. And the constraint there is, are there enough interesting products that are going to pull us out of a combustion alternative? So if I'm buying a car for less than $50,000, is the form factor there that I'm looking for at the price point that I want with the set of features and attributes that I'm looking for? And I would say today there is not nearly enough choice. There's very few highly compelling choices under $50,000. It's one of the reasons I'm so excited about taking our brand into the R2 and R3 segment. But the other big driver, and this is important to note, is what's happening at the policy side. And most developed countries have made commitments to fully electrify by somewhere between 2035 and 2040. Most of Europe is 2035. And then uniquely in the United States, a number of states have made that election, the biggest of which is California. And California has a governing body called the California Air Resource Board. And for California and states that also follow this CARB, or California Resource Board standard, by 2035, from there forward, you will not be able to buy a vehicle with an engine in it. And it used to be that a few years ago, that felt a long way away. 2035, oh, that's going to be ways out. That's right around the corner. That's 10 years from now. And so when you take a step back and recognize that in 10 years, you will not be able to buy a car in California with an engine in it, it sort of is like, whoa, this is like, we as an industry need to start making more products and giving customers more choices, because that's going to be here before we know it. And so the nature of that question is entirely why Rivian exists, and entirely why I say this all the time. We need others to exist. And I do think, somewhat unfortunately, there's often the view that there's going to be or should be a single winner in transportation. The scale is too large. Customers' desires for differentiation and uniqueness means that by very definition, we need to have many winners. So there needs to be, Tesla, a Rivian, a bunch of existing car companies that develop and create compelling products. And I believe that so fully. It's embedded in why we've done this big deal with Volkswagen. But we're going to see that play out. So my hope is, in answer to that question, is that we start to see a lot of really exciting choices from us and others at prices that make this new technology available to a broad spectrum of customers. And I hope that we cause customers to run towards it faster than the policy is going to drive us towards it.
That's awesome. So I'll make this the last question. This is, so apparently we have a new graduate class called Engineering, Business, and Technology Translations. And so, or no, sorry, So the questioner is George Rizos. And he asks, how did you go from making a line of trucks and SUVs built on the same chassis platform to delivery vans?
Well, it was good we talked about network architectures and designing computers and software stack. As different as those two things look, we build this big van. It's a 700 cubic foot van. We build that in a 500 cubic foot van. Amazon's our big customer. We now have the largest deployed fleet of electric vehicles in the world. There's over 20,000 of them driving. I don't know if they're here in Troy, but you've seen them over in California. Yeah, they're cool. As different as they look, they're running a common network architecture with what's in our R1 products. A lot of the software stack, certainly the operating systems are shared. And even some of the power electronics that we developed are shared. And so the idea behind that, and when we went to Amazon and said we want to build this with you as our first customer, it was to leverage this vertically integrated technology stack across a more diverse set of offerings and going after a space that's notoriously inefficient, in part because it sits still so often. People think of a big van and you think of it driving. You also need to think of a big van and think of it idling. And so there's a massive opportunity that exists there to clean up those vehicles. And it was really our mission that drove us to create that product.
That's great, great insight. RJ, I think I can speak for the whole audience. It's just so delightful to have you back here. We've clearly seen how brilliant you are and how deep you think about these things and your commitment to what you're doing. You mentioned mission multiple times, and I think that message really comes through in how you got from 2008 to where you are today. So congratulations and thanks so much for being with us.
Helping out.
Thank you both for a wonderful conversation. RJ, we are delighted to have you home. We're delighted to have his family with us. And welcome to RPI, welcome to our weekend.